hospital rock. It's our presentation in half, and we'll take about 25 or 30 minutes apiece. I'm going to give you some background on smallpox. And Dr. Arcari, Ralph will present more local information and some stories about what happened in this area in the 1790s and beyond. Many of you may know I'm a cardiologist by trade, but I'm the son of a public health doctor, and I've always believed very strongly that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That proved to be extraordinarily true in the case of smallpox. Smallpox is the first great epidemic, disastrous disease ever to be eradicated by humankind. And that is a very remarkable thing to be able to say. There are a lot of diseases we'd like to eradicate. We'd like to get rid of AIDS, and we'd like to get rid of tuberculosis, we'd like to get rid of malaria. But smallpox is the one that, because of some peculiarities of that particular disease, we could eradicate, and it worked. Smallpox has always been one of the most terrible plagues of mankind. I have some personal family experience with it. One of my original people who came to this country in 1630 wrote that as he passed across the Atlantic on the ship Talbot, 14 of his shipmates died of smallpox. I had another ancestor who was an old Quaker down in Pennsylvania, a man named Thomas Dixon. In 1750, he bought a cradle for his little child. In the cradle, unbeknownst to him, were some scabs from a smallpox victim, and 2 weeks later he was dead. The child survived. Smallpox has been endemic for centuries. It was a part of life. It was something that was so common that the saying was that your children were not your own until they had survived smallpox. It killed enormous numbers of people, children and adults. It probably came out of the African rainforests. There are a number of pox diseases that are like smallpox. It's what's called a DNA virus. I didn't even bring you a picture of it because it's a dull-looking little thing. It looks like a little tiny brick. It's capable of multiplying very rapidly, and once it invades the human system, disease is present within 2 weeks. Because there's an incubation period, there was a time during which a patient could be inoculated after exposure, and the disease could still be prevented. So that many locales where smallpox was about to become epidemic were prevented by the use of vaccines in the old days. However, the principal means of eradicating smallpox was actually to discover cases, isolate them, and prevent the spread by very simple means of preventing person-to-person contact. Unfortunately, as in the story of my own ancestor, it could be transmitted by scabs. And so once the scabs fell off the smallpox victim, they were very, very definitely capable of infecting other people, and frequently did. One attack of smallpox confers lifetime immunity. And so you would see situations where it would become epidemic in an area, and then it would disappear for many, many years because people would be immune to it. Subsequently, after a period during which the population may even have become more casual about smallpox, it would reappear, become epidemic, and be another natural disaster. In the colonies in the very early days, it was principally in the epidemic form in America. In Europe, in the big urban centers, smallpox was so common as to be almost continuously present within, let's say, London or Paris or the other large cities of Europe, particularly cities in which there was a great deal of nautical trade, and also particularly in any city to which armies returned after campaigns. They would bring smallpox back with them. The disease itself, we'll show you some pictures in a little while. It has an abrupt onset with high fever, chills, prostration, really disastrous presentation. In children, there's a great deal of vomiting and diarrhea and GI upset. On day 3 of the disease, the eruption eruption appears, little hard nodules in the skin, which then become vesicles containing fluid, and later have pus in the vesicles. And then as they heal, they leave the most abominable scars. It was the commonest cause of blindness in the 17th century. People well known to you were scarred by it. George Bernard Shaw, George Washington, and others. Benjamin Franklin's son died of it. But there were always people who had been scarred by smallpox. And one of the commonest laments of the romantics of the era was that beautiful young women would be permanently scarred for life and just be abominably injured by this disease. After the disease was over, immunity was permanent. Immunity was not permanent after vaccination and so-called variolation, which were the ways of inoculating people against the disease. But because the immunity was not permanent after these ways of preventing spread, people would, unbeknownst to themselves, become susceptible to the disease again, and there might be recurrences in a community. So it was a little tricky, and a very lethal and a very terrible disorder. There's a whole family of pox viruses around, which are sort of like smallpox. One of them is the so-called vaccinia, or cowpox, which was the material that Edward Jenner used in developing the first really successful vaccine for smallpox at the end of the 18th century. Smallpox first appeared many thousands of years ago. It was probably present in the Nile Valley 5,000 years BC. An Egyptian mummy has been identified as probably having had smallpox. Records from ancient China and the Vedas, the sacred books of ancient India, record the occurrence of smallpox, and incidentally record that these people knew a little bit about how to prevent it. They were inoculating against it by various means. It began to invade the European and the North African landmass around 1000 AD, and it was thoroughly brought back into Europe by the Crusaders at their return around 1200 AD, 13 or 1400. It was spread to the Americas by the European voyagers beginning in the 1790s. It caused the utmost, unbelievable devastation among the native populations of North and South America, and indeed any native populations who had not been previously exposed. Among Europeans, mortality was 20% from smallpox. If you got it, you had a 20% chance of not surviving. Among native populations, by inbred lack of immunity, there was a much higher mortality. About the 16th century, smallpox underwent a great increase in virulence. So the disease, which had previously not been quite as severe when you caught it, became much more lethal and much more dangerous. In 18th century England, 1/3 of childhood deaths were due to smallpox. 90% of cases were in children. Of everyone born, 1 in 14 would die of smallpox. And of all cases, 1 in 5 or 6 died. So that what Eli Todd was doing at Hospital Rock and other variolators, the earlier form, or vaccinators, the later form, was to prevent a disease which was very widespread and very dangerous. As late as 1967, smallpox was endemic, meaning it was pervasive in the population in 31 countries. There were 10 or 15 million cases a year, and in the world, 2 million deaths a year from smallpox. It was extraordinarily lethal and dangerous. In 1967, the World Health Organization began an initiative to get rid of smallpox. Since the very beginning of variolation in Western Europe and America, and with the invention of vaccination by Jenner in the late 1790s, everyone who worked with this disease intensely conceptualized the fact that it could be eliminated completely. And eventually, by golly, it was. The last case occurred the last natural case in 1977. The only smallpox virus remaining in the world today is in the CDC in Atlanta, the Centers for Disease Control of the American Public Health Service, and in Moscow. There are vials of this disease frozen. You may see in the paper periodically that there are initiatives now to destroy the disease completely. It's ironic in these days when we're so careful to conserve species such as the snail darter and other little organisms that get in the way of civilization's supposed progress, there is debate over whether this disease should be destroyed, whether this virus should be destroyed. No one is very sentimental about it. They don't feel about it the way they feel about fuzzy little animals out in the woods. But it's a major step, and those of us who respect the workings of nature, even if it was terrible, do not wholeheartedly subscribe to destroying the disease. We are afraid that it will fall into the hands of terrorists, could be used as a weapon. There are millions of doses of smallpox vaccine still available. So the debate goes on. The virus probably will be destroyed with a deadline of about the year 2000. Anyhow, it came to America with the earliest settlers. The first people to arrive found that the Indians, let's say at Plymouth, had been devastated, and really Plymouth had been emptied by a disease before the Pilgrims settled. The disease was probably not smallpox. For some reason, it didn't really get out into the New England colonies until about 1634, at which time it was very widespread and very lethal. Quotations from the Winthrop journals, November of 1633, great mortality among the Indians. December, John Sagamore died and almost all of his people. The same month, James Sagamore of Saugus and most of his folks. January of 1634, it had spread as far as any plantations to the west of Plymouth. The same month, 700 Indians died at Narragansett. Other outbreaks among the Indians, the Great Lakes in Canada, 1633 to 1641, the Hurons and the Iroquois in 1640, the Mohawks in 1669, the Southern Indians, which would be the Cherokees and the Crees and Creeks and so on, in 1667. 1690, there was a horrible epidemic of Quebec among the Indians, and in 1717. There were instances, which are well known, in which clothing and bed sheets saturated with smallpox scabs were given to the Indians. So that there was some deliberate germ warfare going on, and say no more about that. It was spread by soldiers. There were epidemics when the soldiers came back from the French and Indian Wars. There were epidemics during the Revolution. An expedition to Montreal failed because of smallpox among the troops. It was very common in 1776 and 7, and then George Washington initiated variolation, the earlier form of inoculation, among his troops. And it became well known that if you were in the Army and you were variolated and you survived the 2% mortality from variolation, that you were protected for life. So there was some enthusiasm for being among those colonial troops who were variolated. There were some outbreaks, for example, at Valley Forge. During that winter, variolation became extremely common, and the outbreak ceased, and the troops were protected.
Could you explain what variolation is?
I'll come back to it. It's a form of inoculation. So the disease was spread by soldiers, but it was also extremely common among the civilian population. In Boston, during one lifetime, people were exposed to 7 major epidemics. There were epidemics in Boston in 1649, 1677, 1689, 1702, a terrible epidemic in 1721, and more in 1730, 52, 76, 78, 92. And it was an epidemic in this area in 1792 to 94, which is why we're telling you about Eli Todd tonight. And I will tell you about variolation. Enough about the different epidemics. I began counting up epidemics and recording the ones that I ran across in the literature, and I eventually stopped because the disease was so much part of the fabric of life and death that it was just there virtually all the time. Epidemics have been present in New England right up into this century. My hometown of Brattleboro, Vermont had one after the return of troops from the Spanish-American War. England and Wales in 1927, there were 12,000 cases. The U.S. in 1930, 48,000 cases. So it was a big part of our life experience right up into the middle of this century. Okay, you'd like to know what variolation is, and I'm here to tell you. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, smallpox produces a little pustule. It's like a pimple. It's a little bump with a thing in the middle and pus in it. They would open the pustule of smallpox pull a thread through it. Now, they could pull the thread through without opening it. And then, on the arm of the person to be inoculated against smallpox, one would make a little incision and pull the thread through the incision, giving the person a localized smallpox, just in a little area. But this was the real thing. This was the virus of smallpox, so that it was perfectly possible for the person being variolated to develop disseminated smallpox, and 2% of them died of it. Now, the change from variolation to vaccination is very important, and I'll come back to that. But remember that variolation was the earlier form, and the form which Eli Todd used. Variolation came to England in 1718 and 1720 because of the efforts of a woman named Mary Wortley Montagu. Lady Montagu was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey. As a little child, about your size, she had been the favorite of the Kit Kat Club in London, which was a highbrow literary club. She was bounced on the knees of the litterateurs in London, and really was the darling of the group and considered very beautiful. Her brother died of smallpox in 1713. She got smallpox in 1750 and was horribly scarred. She lost her eyebrows, she lost hair, she had pox all over the face, and she was really disfigured. She went to Turkey and discovered there that they were using variolation, which is what I described to you just before. She had her son variolated. She took a chance. There was smallpox epidemic in Turkey. She had him variolated, and he survived. A couple of years later, she had her daughter variolated back when they returned to England from their diplomatic mission. And through her efforts, variolation became widespread in its use in England, and eventually it was approved by the Royal College of Physicians in 1754. Now, coming to America, in 1721, the British ship Seahorse landed in Boston. It came into the docks in downtown Boston by the harbor. They had a couple of cases of smallpox on board, but people weren't that worried. And then a few days later, the plague flags were out. There were red flags on the fronts of buildings on the Boston waterfront, and people were dying from flies. In Boston, which was then a town of 11,000, 5,980 people got smallpox. That's half the population, and of those, 844 died. It was an absolute disaster. In Boston at that time lived Cotton Mather and his neighbor Zabdiel Boylston, a physician. Cotton Mather was a member of that amazing group of divines, the Mather family, who were scientists and divines involved in the Salem witchcraft trials, and just a really remarkable family of people. Cotton Mather, dabbling in science, decided that variolation might save people in Boston, and he talked his neighbor, Zabdiel Boylston, into variolating people in Boston. And they saved many, many lives by variolating Bostonians at that time. Interestingly enough, they were opposed by the only university graduate physician, a guy named Douglas, who had gone to school in Scotland and thought he knew better. He didn't, and eventually he came around to their point of view. Variolation, which is what I described before with making a little scar and putting some virus into the incision, was widespread in its practice at the time of the Revolution. There are a couple of examples of people who, in one case, the father was a Tory and had to leave the country, and the son was not a Tory and could stay in the country, and they both did variolation, one for the British and one for the Americans. So there's some interesting little vignette stories. In Boston in 1764, there was a variolation hospital that was so busy that even Gideon Wells came up from Connecticut to help. He was a Harvard physician. In Marblehead, at about the same time, there was an utter disaster again in which smallpox became epidemic in the variolation hospital to which people were moved, and many people died. That brings us to the other part of the story, which is that of vaccination. Variola is smallpox in the Latin. Vaccinia is cowpox. Cowpox was discovered by Edward Jenner to prevent the occurrence of smallpox among milkmaids who got cowpox on their hands from milking cows. Turned out that, like a lot of these things, it had been known among the milkmaids for a long time, but Jenner got the credit. The doc came in and got the credit. But the milkmaids had known about it for a long time. Again, Jenner vaccinated his own son There are many instances of this in which a person trusted this so much that they made their little child the first person to get the treatment for the disease and be protected. The first vaccination, he took vaccinia virus from the hands of Sarah Nelms, who was a milkmaid in Gloucestershire, and he inoculated a little boy named Phipps. And Phipps was later challenged with smallpox and didn't get it, so Jenner knew he had the answer. He too thought the disease could be eliminated eventually. He sent his findings in to the Royal Society, and they turned him down. They wouldn't publish it because they said what he had written was entirely too revolutionary. He had done work on the cuckoo and the nesting habits of the cuckoo, and the Royal Society said to Jenner, your work on the cuckoo has established your reputation. Why are you risking it by publishing something as radical as your story on smallpox? Amazing. It was brought to Boston by Benjamin Waterhouse in 1799. Vaccinia virus was transmitted across the sea sequentially, passing it through young boys who were recruited from orphanages and brought over by ship. It was brought into New England, and the story from then on, I think, is more Ralph's than mine. It leads up to the complete eradication of this disease. There are a few items that are sort of interest to me personally. There are a lot of viruses still around that are of this family. There's monkeypox, horsepox, camelpox, goatpox, whitepox, and even buffalo pox. And there's a lot of concern that one or more of these pox viruses might mutate into a smallpox-like virus. This has been looked at by geneticists, and to those who are well informed in genetics, it does not appear likely to occur. But there are other concerns. For example, some of you may have noticed the Iceman who was recovered from the snows of the Alps recently. It is thought that the virus might have survived in a deep freeze form in a preserved body of that sort. So there's still a good deal of concern, and there's still going to be an effort made to keep the vaccinia virus available, the cowpox virus. Another interesting little vignette. The cowpox virus that is our vaccinia today is genetically unlike cowpox of Jenner's time. So something has happened. Either it's a different virus, or there was a contaminant or a mutation or something. Just to summarize, it's the most extraordinarily pervasive story. It extends into the rich and the poor, the famous, the less than famous, among all populations. And the story of its control and eradication is very dramatic. We have a few slides to show you the disease, and I'd like to just point those out to you before we close.
Chickenpox related?
Chickenpox is not the same family, but it is a pox. Great pox, of course, is syphilis, and smallpox was variola, so the great pox is still very much out there. This is one of the earliest writers on smallpox, the Arabian physician Rhazes, who did a beautiful description of the disease. Next slide, please. That's our title slide. Next slide, please. This is the eastern seaboard of the United States, and smallpox came in at all of these points of entry to the States. There was a hotbed of smallpox in the West Indies, and the triangle trade in rum, sugar, and molasses and slaves into the West Indies brought it up to New England. Next slide, please. There's Rhazes again. He's a bear for publicity. This is Dr. Clark, the progenitor of a family of 7 physicians and the model for one of Hawthorne's famous stories, which is a little reminiscence of the Mask of the Red Death. The physicians in the early days in the colonies were very brilliant men, but had very little at their disposal for treating this disease, and Dr. Clark was not an exception. Next slide, please. This is Lady Mary Wortley Montague, dressed in her Turkish ambassador's outfit, even with a little dagger at her belt. How many of you know about Horace Walpole? We have the Walpole Library up in Farmington. He met her in Italy in 1740 and wrote the most scathing description of her. Apparently she had been scarred horribly, and this was a slide that imagined her former beauty, I think. Next slide, please. This is cotton mather. Next slide, please. This is the smallpox hospital on an island in Boston Harbor. Next slide, please. And this is Smallpox in New England, written by Zabiel Boylston, who was the very brave physician, Cotton Mather's neighbor, who variolated all those people in Boston in 1721. He was made a member of the Royal Academy in London. There's a lot of transatlantic information sharing. Next slide, please. And this is the great treatise by Edward Jenner, which he had to have published privately because the Royal Academy thought it was too radical. Next slide. And this is Benjamin Waterhouse, right?
Right.
Yep, Benjamin Waterhouse, who brought the vaccination to Boston, professor of medicine at Harvard. Incidentally, just incidentally, he wouldn't let the stuff get out of his hands into the community because he wanted to make a little profit on it. Very interesting commentary.
That was Jenner. This is Waterhouse.
What is it? That's it. Okay. Now this is a pock of smallpox. This shows what it looks like. Why don't we just run through these quickly? And this is a person with the disease. You can see how terrible it is. Next slide, please. Pox on the hand of the victim before they get pus in them. Infant with smallpox. Next slide. You can see how it gets in the eyes and the eyelids and stars. These are beginning to get pus in them. Okay. Next slide, please. The baby in Africa covered with smallpox. And this is our hero. I think I split the time down.
That's okay. My name is Ralph Arcari. I'm director of the library at the University of Connecticut Health Center. I teach the history of medicine at the University of Connecticut Health Center. We're very pleased to have such a large audience tonight. You might be interested to notice the fourth time we've done this presentation, so a lot of interest in this topic. I want to give you a little bit of background on Eli Todd first, and how he came to be associated with Hospital Rock and smallpox. So first, a little biographical information on Eli Todd. Todd was born in 1769 in New Haven, and he graduated Yale University in 1787. Now, in the 18th century, the period that we're talking about, it was common practice to have doctors who did not go to medical school. There weren't that many medical schools in this country, and the doctors basically learned their profession through an apprenticeship program. So Todd apprenticed with a Dr. Ebenezer Beardsley from 1787 to 1789 in New Haven. In 1789, he came to Farmington to practice medicine. As you all know, you know better than I do, this was all Farmington. We were in the area, Plainville, Avon, Farmington itself, Simsbury, that was all one town. So in 1789, Eli Todd came to practice medicine in what is now several towns that was then Farmington. So he was only 20 years old when he came to practice medicine in this area. In 1792, he established Hospital Rock. Now here's the sequence on Hospital Rock is based on what Dr. Leach has described. Because when they variolated, you were possibly a carrier of that illness, you can infect somebody else. After you were variolated in this period, before Jenner and his vaccination, you had to go into a quarantine period for 3 weeks so that you would not be contagious to other people. So that's the idea. And Hospital Rock is the place where Eli Todd established people would go for that 3-week period. And I'll show you a few pictures later on. That's what you're all here for. You want to see Hospital Rock. We got plenty, don't worry, it's coming. Let's talk about deferred gratification. We've got to get through all the background first. So Hospital Rock was established by Todd as the place where people would go. He didn't call it Hospital Rock. It was basically called the pest house is what they call it. We call it Hospital Rock. And you'll see why. But he established a pest house where people would go for 3 weeks after they had been inoculated against smallpox. And Hospital Rock is located on Rattlesnake Mountain. When you see those radio antennas and TV antennas that are huge with the lights blinking, that's where Hospital Rock is, right up on top of that mountain. And the reason the rock is significant, why it's called Hospital Rock, is because, for two reasons. One, the rock appears to have had a usefulness. Because you were on top of that mountain, quarantined from the town so you wouldn't be contagious to other people, people dropped off clothing, food, and letters at the rock, and the people who had been inoculated would come down to the rock to pick them up, but there'd be no contact between the people. So the rock served as a drop-off point, basically, in the late 18th century. And as you're going to see, the people who are at the Hospital Rock, those who are in the pest house, carved their names in the rock. There's 66 names of people who have been inoculated carved in the rock. So that's the significance of Hospital Rock, as we'll see. What I want to give you also is some characteristics of Dr. Todd himself. Todd must have been, and definitely was, a very humanitarian individual and a very caring physician, an individual who thought a lot about his responsibility for the health of the community. In 1808, Todd was commended by the governor of the state of Connecticut for his services during another epidemic called the spotted fever epidemic. Todd did not leave Farmington when the spotted fever epidemic was decimating and killing people in this town. He stayed, even though at danger to himself, which is an ethical issue that smallpox had associated with it, other epidemics, and it exists today. What is a physician's responsibility during an epidemic, including AIDS? You take care of the ill at the risk to yourself. What's your ethical responsibility? Todd came down on the side of staying with the people who were ill. So that's the type of person he was. Until I started researching this, though, I didn't know that Todd's major claim to acknowledgement in the medical community is the fact that he established the Institute of Living in Hartford Hospital. Todd is the one who established that institution almost single-handedly. Todd was convinced, because of some family problems with mental illness, that mental illness was a disease. It's not some criminal conduct. Up until the French Revolution, which is the same period of time that we're talking about, 1790s, the mentally ill were basically treated as though they were criminals. They were chained and handcuffed and put away and locked away. And then the French Revolution not only overturned a lot of previous thinking on how government should be run, it also overturned a lot of other traditional thinking, including medical thinking. And Dr. Philippe Pinnacle in France said, we got to stop treating people as though they're criminals because they have mental problems. And Todd picked up on that theme, and he said, we're going to treat people humanely. We're going to establish a hospital, and we're going to put people in that hospital and treat them as though they had an illness. They're sick people. They shouldn't be chained. And that's really what is significant about Eli Todd, is that he not only championed the Institute of Living, he went to the General Assembly, got money, and became the first superintendent. So Eli Todd was the first director of the Institute of Living in Hartford, and in 1827, he also became, he was very well recognized for his professionalism. He became president of the Connecticut Medical Society, and he died in 1833. No, he did not have any children. He married sequentially two sisters, and he had no children by either of them. And when he died, his next project that he had in mind is he wanted to establish a hospital for alcoholics. He maintained that alcoholism was a disease, and you shouldn't be treating these people as criminals. Definitely a man who was ahead. In 1827, when you talked about alcoholism as a disease, you were ahead of your time. And I've done some reading on Eli Todd, and he wasn't exactly appreciated for taking these rather advanced points of view. Like, in those days, if you were an alcoholic, there was something wrong, criminally wrong with you, and you needed to be treated like you had an illness. So that's who this person is. This is the person who established Hospital Rock. Can I have the next slide, please, Charlie? This is Todd's house. Now, it wasn't located where it is now. This is the house on, I'm going to need some light to be able to read some more, though. I didn't bring a little flashlight with me. I'll have to bear with this on and off light. But if you can see it, this is the house that's across the street from Farmington Savings Bank on Main Street in Farmington. Okay? And one of the many times we gave this talk, one of the resident of that house, who is a doctor in that house, it seems to always have been occupied by doctors, came up to Charlie and I afterward and talked to us and explained how she lived there and what she was doing with the house. This house probably was not, definitely was located farther to the south and having moved here. But that's the house that Todd lived in, and it's still there as it's at that. It still exists, and it's at that location I mentioned, right across from the Farmington Savings Bank on Route 10 in Farmington. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Todd's grave. This monument there is Todd's grave. That's located in Old North Cemetery in Hartford. And it took me a while to find that grave. So, when I first gave a talk, I didn't know where the grave was, and I told the audience, next time I give this talk, I'm going to find out where Todd is buried. Well, there's a series of books at the Connecticut State Library that list every burial plot in Connecticut to 1930. So I went there and I found where Todd was. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you. So I found where Todd was buried in the cemetery, but didn't say where in the cemetery. It just said in the cemetery. And, so I went wandering around. I got to tell you, this cemetery, if you want to know where the cemetery is, it's on North Main Street in Hartford. And, you know, I'm going to be candid, it's not in a good section of the city. And my sister and my wife are saying, what do you want to be wandering around that cemetery for? And you know, so I made sure I got there real early in the morning, because people who are interested in violence, they have to sleep too, you know? They sleep late. They're fun tonight, they're busy, you know? So I get there about 7:30 in the morning to make these pictures. I figured they would be out. The cemetery is a mess. It's a mess. And coincidentally, my grandfather's buried in the same cemetery. So I found his grave while I was doing this research. But this is the gravestone for Eli Todd. And there's a lot of famous people in that cemetery. G. Fox is buried there. Yep. And the founder, David Watkinson, after whom the Watkinson School and the Watkinson Library at Trinity College is buried there. And Horace Bushnell is buried there. So there's a number, it really has a lot of history in that cemetery. There's a cemetery right next door called Mountain Spring Cemetery, I believe it is. This is a public cemetery, so unfortunately, because of the tax base erosion in Hartford and the problems of economics in Hartford, this cemetery is not well taken care of. The one next door, which is private, has an equally number of famous, notable people, but it's much better maintained. So, got the next slide, please? So you'll see, this is a close-up. Next slide, please. Okay, this is looking down on the grave, and you can see it's inscribed. You can't see well. It says Eli Todd, and the next slide is significant. This is what that inscription says. Eli Todd, first physician in Connecticut retreat for the insane, deeply sensible of his important services in establishing and originating and establishing that institution, and by his successful practice evaluating his character high in public esteem, the directors have caused the monument to be erected. See, what I thought was significant there is that the directors of the Connecticut Retreat for the Insane established and put this monument to Todd in place. Not his family. That's how well regarded he was. That the institution that he had established developed the tombstone for him. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a picture of Rattlesnake Mountain, and it's right in this area. This is taken from the front of the University of Connecticut Health Center, School of Medicine. It's right in this area where Hospital Rock is located. Now I want to talk a little bit, while we'll leave that slide up, I want to mention I want to have a few comments on Todd himself by people who gave testimonials about him during his lifetime and just after his death. This is from a memorial of history of Hartford County, and the author is Dr. Ashiel Thompson. He says, Dr. Todd was a man of rare mental endowments. He possessed in a high degree the various characteristics of superior genius. His intellect was strong and vigorous, capable of readily comprehending, mastering, and illustrating any subject to which his attention was directed. His judgment was profound, clear, and discriminating. His apprehension remarkably quick, his memory strongly retentive, his imagination and fancy brilliant and ever awake, and his taste delicate and refined, the source of much enjoyment to himself and the means of much pleasure to others. His conversational powers were uncommon. This is an unusual man. He's not just a doctor. a medical doctor. He's also, as indicated, also very sensitive to people, but he also was an accomplished cellist. He established the Handel Society in Farmington, so he engaged in literary discussions. So he had he was what would be called a Renaissance man. Another, I want to read another passage. This is a passage describing how Dr. Todd treated people who were brought to the Institute of Living. Dr. Todd, the eminent and kind physician in charge of the retreat, gladly communicated his plans and showed them to us over every part of the noble establishment, a model, I venture to say, from which any country might take instruction. Dr. Todd's method is to treat every insane patient as if he were a reasonable being. When a patient is brought to the retreat, the physician convenes with him freely and without attempting to deceive, states that all that is known of the patient's case. The physician explains that the patient is brought there for the purpose of being cured of a disease which happens to affect his mind as it might have done his body. That he will have every possible freedom consistent with his own safety and the comfort of his friends. So I just want to give a picture of Todd, the type of person he was. And you can see he definitely was an individual who cared for those who were sick, both physically and mentally. Now, we get to Hospital Rock and its establishment. He said if Dr. Todd came to Farmington when he was 20 years old, that's in 1789. 3 years later, he'd only been about 23, 24. He proposed to establish this pest house, this clinic where people would be vaccinated. So the records of the town indicate that Dr. Todd and a Dr. Theodore Wadsworth petitioned the town council for permission to establish and open a hospital for the purpose of inoculating for smallpox. This was granted at the town meeting of December 12, 1791, and was at their hospital during the summers of the 1790s that inoculations were performed on the young people whose names are carved on Hospital Rock. Have the next slide, please. Okay, this is Hospital Rock. I thought it was going to be a vertical rock with people's names carved on it. It's flat, and that's what you're seeing. All it is an outcropping, and it's flat, and a lot of growth has taken place on it over the years. So this is what Hospital Rock looks like, and this is a description of it from an 1895 article on the subject of Hospital Rock. On the mountain where the trap rock that largely composes the mountain itself comes to the surface and slightly projects above the surrounding ground, Hospital Rock, near the site of the hospital that bears names of initials of most, if not all, of those who were patients there in their self-imposed banishment for health. The rock has at least 66 inscriptions, many with dates, most of the names of those prominent Farmington families. It is supposed that patients there visited the rock during their days of illness and quarantine, not ill enough to be in bed, but not allowed to even distantly meet the village representatives who came with food and other necessaries. The rock has been more than once overgrown with fir trees, which, when pulled away, have discovered the deeply chiseled names and dates. So that's a description from 100 years ago of Hospital Rock. The people who were there, Charlie and I tried to find out where the hospital might have been. We think it might have been above the rock where the actual buildings where people slept and ate, but there's not much trace. And our assumption is that those buildings are most probably wooden temporary buildings, and there was no foundation dug that would give you any indication where the buildings actually were. But people seem to have had a pleasant time there. It wasn't seem to you were inoculated, and it doesn't seem to have been a situation where people were adversely affected by conditions. It was done at a pleasant time of the year. It wasn't in the middle of winter. They usually did this in the late summer and early fall. And so it looks like one writer indicates that several marriages took place based on friendships that developed while people were patients at Hospital Rock. There's an interesting quote from a young man writing in the 1790s about the effects of Hospital Rock on the social situation, one might say. A young man in Farmington writes to a friend that all the young girls here are up at the pest house. I've been up to the goat pasture to see them. There are as thick as toads after a rain. Nancy Hooker and Fanny Coles have it the hardest, but they all do well, I believe. So it looks like this Hospital Rock put a dent in the social life of the young men at the time, because all the girls up there at Hospital Rock. Have the next slide, please. Okay, these are some of the inscriptions in Hospital Rock. What I did when I went up there is I took some flour and I spread the flour onto the rock so the names would pop out. So you can see it says Smallpox right down here on the rock. It is an eerie feeling. It's like something out of Twilight Zone. You walk into the woods, you see this rock, and yeah, there's probably some inscriptions on that rock. You can see some writing there. You put this, then put some regular flour on there, and to see Smallpox jump out as a name, you saw in the previous slides what smallpox looks like. It's not something. It's not like getting acne. It's serious business, and you could possibly die. This is 200 years ago. The people who wrote this inscription on that rock, they knew they were being inoculated, but they also knew right here in Farmington this could possibly be a deadly disease. And it's kind of it's definitely a feeling of local history when you can see that at this rock people were there and they inscribed their names and the words. Here's the word smallpox right on the rock itself. Okay, next slide, please. Here's some of the names on the rock. Some of them are crudely written. This one is one of the cruder names written on the rock. I'm not sure this particular name, by the way, is from that period, but you'll see some dates on the rock as well. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. This is a William Hobbs, and you can see down here it says, you can't see it well because of the lighting. Probably turn the lights off altogether because then you can see better. Okay, it says 1792 right there on the rock. Next slide, please. This is a Brownman right in here. Is the name of one of the people that's on the rock. G.B. Brownman. Next slide, please. This is Edward Hooker. And it says 1794 over there. These are some of the prominent names on this rock. Next, please. Can't see very well.
Ann Street.
Ann Street. There it is up there, right? Ann Street up in here. Next slide, please. And you can see how they're all clustered on this rock. So you've got Mary Norton, Whitman, Bacon, 1792 over here. Norton, 1794. So the way these names look here on this rock, this is not how this is after they've been enhanced. When you see this initially, you can see some lines, but you can't really make it out very well. So what you're seeing here, you can see the dates, and you can see some of the names. Okay? This might be the last one we have. Next slide, please. No. There's Shabeel Bronson, age 9. So you see they're very young people who were also at the Hospital Rock. Next, the last one. No. Now this is more recently. This is 1905. So some Yahoo went up there in 1905. And he had to put his name out for his girlfriend to see, and he had been there also. But I assure you, we want to keep it this way too. There's nobody up there in 1990 carving their names in this rock. This is probably the most recent name that's up there. That's it. Any other pictures? Now, there's a few more things we want to talk about. I just mentioned. As Dr. Leach indicated, in 1796, Jenner developed vaccination and the process of vaccination using the vaccine from the smallpox and cowpox. And in 1827, there was a incidence of smallpox in Farmington, and without going through all the numbers, we have the data that indicates from the schools what numbers of people were vaccinated and from what schools. So in 1827, there were 1,500 students vaccinated in Farmington with the vaccination, not the variolation, vaccination. And there's 15 schools. There's the Burr, the Nod, the Wheeler, and so that in less than about a little more than a generation, we went from smallpox at Hospital Rock with variolation with a 2% risk to vaccination in the school system. So Hospital Rock is 1792. Jenner had promoted vaccination in 1794. So Hospital Rock is just before the change. Because after that, you had a lot of vaccination taking place as a matter of procedure in the school system. And the other thing I want to mention and read, and just to wrap up on Todd, one more comment on how type of person Todd was. Hartford, as we know, in the 19th century, had a number of literary figures associated with it. We all are aware of Mark Twain's presence in Hartford and Harriet Beecher Stowe. But there was a Lydia Sigourney, was called the songstress of Hartford. She was a poet. And when Todd died, she wrote a eulogy for Todd. That's 19th century writing at its, whatever you picture it as. It's, you know, flowery and effusive, etc. But I won't read the whole eulogy. But this is Lydia Sigourney's poem entitled "Thoughts on the Death of Dr. Todd, Principal of the Retreat for the Insane." This could be written about anybody, I suppose, who was somebody trying to extol. But here's what she says in the first few lines: "Few have been mourned like thee, the wise and good, do gather many weepers round their tomb, and true affection makes her heart an urn for the departed idol, till that heart is ashes. With such sorrow art thou mourned, yet more than thus. There is a cry of woe within the halls of your majestic dome, a tide of grief which heaven may not check." And it goes on and on. But it's more than I can read. The point I'm trying to make is not that what was said about Dr. Eli Todd by Lydia Sigourney. The fact is that Lydia Sigourney wrote it all about Eli Todd. She was well recognized as a literary person, and Todd's reputation as the founder of the retreat was a development that took place obviously later in his life. The type of person I think that we can see that Todd was grounded in his efforts here in Farmington as a physician, and his humanitarian instincts are exemplified in the development of what we have here, Hospital Rock. Thank you very much. And we'll take questions or comments.